Right, everyone, I'm Klloo. So, safe to say I'm still pretty obsessed with Maxx, right? Again, the Armory deck has made him playable to decent, but, we strive for slightly above that, so I'm still fine-tuning a hard aggro line deck, right? So, I've been asked from time to time to sort of go into deck construction, right? Now, in all honesty, there are a lot of great foundational resources out there for you by, fantastic other YouTube content creators for Flesh and Blood, but I will try my best, right? Using Maxx as the medium as we slowly tweak the deck. So, generally speaking, when it comes to deck construction, I kind of get fixated on a group of cards or an interaction or a combo that I want to build the deck around, right? Call it a lack of a true competitive streak, right? I just want to show off something fancy. Now, obviously, we're not doing that today because that's not the crux of Flesh and Blood. The crux of Flesh and Blood is a good old back and forth beatdown, right? With a nice solid deck and interactive mechanics. So, how can we fine-tune Maxx to do that? Or in general, how can we build a deck to do so? Well, generally speaking, I break things down into a few different components, right? We have our hero and our equipment, and this usually circulates around a core principle or core mechanic that we're undergoing. So, for instance, with Maxx, that is creating a hyperdriver and swinging with our wrench Banksy. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to Banksy, it is a quite interesting weapon. So, technically, it is a 1 for 3 that does something, so that means it is kind of above rate, right? So a 1 for 3 that is just a 1 for 3 is generally what we'd see as a weapon. Now, Banksy has the lock, right, of you have to have cranked this turn in order to swing with it, meaning that it's a 1 for 3 in theory that does something, but generally speaking, with just Maxx as the core interaction, it becomes a 3 for 3 that does something and stores 1 resource. That, unfortunately, puts it behind rate, right? So, it's not horrible. It can technically value itself out if you land and you get the Steam counter, but technically speaking, you're paying 1 extra resource than what you necessarily should in a comparison to, say, another hero with another weapon. Now, we can fix this thanks to our Klloo Foundry Hunt, and this is where equipment plays a core component, right? So think of it, equipment as either foundational or something that helps you, in a sense, win more, right? So Klloo Foundry Hunt for Maxx to me is definitely foundational. It allows us to smooth out that curve and create Banksy as a 2 for 3 weapon that does something and stores 1 resource, right? Again, utilizing Maxx in his hyperdriver creation. We're creating a hyperdriver with 1 counter because we're cranking it, right? And that's storing 1 resource for the following turn. We're then swinging for 3, and if it lands, we get that Steam counter. So altogether, that package is a little bit more solid, but it is still a bit awkward to use here and there. So we can make it even better if we were to, say, play an item. So for instance, we're in hyperdrive, so we're taking hyperdrivers. If we were to play a hyperdriver from hand, that would essentially make Banksy a 1 for 3 that does something and stores a resource, right? So that's beautiful. That is above rate, and that makes it a really, really solid weapon. The only issue there is we're losing a card from hand. So generally speaking, this is the core mechanic that we're building the deck around, at least to me, right? Banksy might not be your go-to when it comes to Maxx. You might be trying to go into Nitro, you might be trying to go into other shenanigans, but Banksy to me is the solid foundation that we are building the deck around today. So when it comes to equipment, how do we facilitate Banksy? Well, thanks to the Armory deck, we have Fist Bump, right? So whenever you banish a Hyperdriver from boosting, target wrench you control gets +1, which allows us to create that nice 4 power breakpoint on Banksy, making it a really, really solid weapon. So if we land the Fist Bump, and that is kind of a big if, it is a solid package. Now, as for everything else, they are sort of more reliant on the deck. So our Achilles Accelerator or our Heavy Industry Gear Shift, which I do enjoy taking more, are basically a free action point to not have to crank an item, right? Which can be a pretty big deal, especially when it comes to the other new item from the Armory deck, the Clamp Press, right? Maintaining that for an extra turn is pretty solid, right? And then for the head, I'm taking and testing HyperX 3. I still can't say I'm too in love with it over our Breaker Helm, but HyperX 3, whenever you banish a Hyperdriver from boosting, put under this, and then once per turn, when a Hyperdriver is put under this, if there are 3 or more Hyperdrivers under this, draw a card. Meaning that once we get to 3, we get a card, so we're probably averaging at least 1 to maybe 2 cards a game, right, with HyperX 3, if we're, again, banking on Fist Bump landing as well. So that is pretty solid. And then for the AB, right, so the Arcane matchups, we have Visitronic Model for AB2, and then we have the Achilles Accelerator as our AB1. So if we need to, we can get to AB3. So again, find that foundational core gameplay loop or mechanic. So Maxx, create a Hyperdriver, swing with Banksy. Find the equipment that synergizes with it. So comparison-wise, Azalea, think about cross wraps, right? That helps solidify her hero mechanic, right? And then think about the other equipment pieces that synergize with it, right? And then think about what they do to the deck. So for instance, through Hyper X3, we are no longer counting on hyperdrivers being in our banish zone, meaning that any interaction with them in the banish zone is something we don't want to think about. We also limit ourselves, in a sense, to how many we can establish on board. So something like the payoff of Construct Bankbreaker or our Nitro, right, is a little bit less optimal. So with that in mind, I wouldn't be thinking about taking those cards, right? Which then brings us to the actual deck cards. So we have above rate cards, we have on rate cards, and then we have our utility and our pitch. So what do I mean by above rate? Well, Flesh and Blood is nice enough to have a vanilla set of cards, although they are sort of quickly getting eclipsed, or at least currently to modern Flesh and Blood, they are being eclipsed. So Wounding Ball, Critical Strike, Brutal Assault, and Raging Onslaught are both vanilla, just textless, essentially, other than the lore text, right? So Wounding Blow, a 0 for 4 with 3 block. Critical Strike, a 1 for 5 with 3 blocks. So as we're going up in cost, we're going up in power, right? So every 1 cost increase, we go up 1 in power. Now, equivalent-wise, if we were to think about Go Again, that would be a reduction in power. So Wounding Ball would be equivalent to a 0 for 3 with Go Again, right? That is the vanilla stat line that we are competing against, if you will. Now, when it comes to their pitch, right? So Wounding Ball, red, pitches for 1. If this was to go up to a yellow Wounding Blow, right, that would make it a 3 power card, right? So that 0-4 stat line becomes 0-3 as we go up to the yellow pitch. Blue brings it down 1 more. So with that in mind, this is the metric that you can always fall back onto when trying to evaluate cards. Now, rationalizing block or their utility effects is going to be a whole different ballpark, but we're starting nice and easy today with a aggro hero, meaning that we don't have to consider too much other than just the raw power stat line. Now, above rates means that we are above that 0-4, right? So it has to be 0-4 plus something. So, Boom Grenade is a 0-4, but it allows us to crank, which allows us to use Banksy. So, in that sense, I am putting it above rate, right? It is solid in my mentality, right? It then also adds pressure to Banksy, which is a big thing I'm striving for with this deck. Forcing our opponent to block as much as possible is how we get over the line as aggro. We're not equivalent to Aurora, we don't have the damage output as Aurora, so we can't force our opponent to lose cards to just raw damage. We need something else to carry us over. So a Boom Grenade on board that then pressures its extra 4 damage with our other cards is solid, right? And then Banksy being able to upkeep it over a Hyperdriver, I think is worth a block from your opponent, more so than, again, that Hyperdriver. Because, generally speaking, in the games that I have played as Maxx, they will allow that 3 damage through, right? They will then give you a counter on Hyperdriver, but they'll deny it on something like Clamp Press. So taking other valuable items to me is generally a solid idea. Now, when it comes to our other cards, so Fast and Furious or Soup Up, these are conditional 0-4 Go Again. So Soup Up, if an item has been destroyed this turn, it gains Go Again. And Fast and Furious, if we've cranked an item this turn, it gains Go Again. So this adds, again, more synergy to items. So Boom Grenade or a lot of the crank items have the clause of, at the start of your turn, destroy this unless you remove a steam counter from it, meaning that they do trigger the effect of Soup Up, right? When we lose it to upkeep because it no longer has steam counters, it does enable Soup Up to be a 0-4 Go Again. Similarly, as Fast and Furious, generally the loop that you're stuck in is throwing out the Hyperdriver from Maxx, cranking it, playing Fast and Furious, losing that Hyperdriver. So by throwing in some other items, we're able to throw out those items and still make Fast and Furious a 0-4. Now, as for everything else, Jumpstart, in most cases, is going to be a 1-5 with Go Again. Throttle, a 2-6 with Go Again. 0-60, 0-4 with Go Again. Zipper Hit, 1-5 Go Again. And then 0-60 Yellow being a 0-3 Go Again, but because it's gone up in pitch, that change from the 4 power to 3 power makes it still above rate. So, generally, this is pretty solid, right? Over a third of our deck is above rate cards, meaning as aggro, that is what we're truly striving for in order to pressure our opponent. Our main core gameplay is to chip them down so that they have to block and therefore we win, right? Because we're just exhausting their hand over and over because we're going wide enough, right? We're not trying to debilitate them through arsenal disruption, hand disruption, or any other debilitating effect. It is just about the raw numbers. Now, when it comes to the on-rate cards, right, these are actually in between, I'd say, right? Some of them are slightly above. So, for instance, we have BIOS Update. Next attack action card you boost this turn gets +3, meaning that it's a 0-3 that also blocks for 3. So, again, that vanilla stat line. But then it also has the secondary ability of the next time a mech-knowledged item with 2 or less is banished to pay a boost cost this turn, put it into the arena. So, this is, again, where my mentality is starting to shift to trying to include a bit more items because of those synergies, right? So BIOS Update hitting something other than a Hyperdriver is definitely worthwhile, right? Because we get it for that extra turn. Now, generally speaking, I was just taking Hyperdrivers and Clamp Press, right? So that is 12 in 60. Well, technically I take the full 73 card. So 12 and 73 for Bios Update to land. Now that changes every turn, but generally speaking, that is not fantastic odds. So by throwing in a few more items, we increase the value of Bios Update and put it slightly above being on rate, right? Then we have Dumpster Dive, which again has synergy with items, or for instance, Sprocket Rocket. So as they are 0 for 3, go again, or 1 for 4, go again, right? But if they do hit that item through boosting, they become above rate. So that is something we definitely like to see. Expedite, right, a 0 for 3, but if it hits, we get to put an item in play. So again, more items to synergize with, right, is fantastic. I've bluffed it many times with Expedite, where, again, the opponent has to consider whether or not to block it, whether or not I'm holding an item, and generally speaking, they've called my bluff, I do the 3 damage, and I don't have an item into play. Now, I have upside because if I get a free item, well, I get that extra steam counter, or I can get the action point and the crank, right? There's lots of ways to do it because, again, when it comes to an extra action point or an extra crank in that sense, we can fall back to Maxx and his hyperdriver, right? If we can make this last with 2 steam counters, we're essentially maintaining the resources we spent rather than losing 1 to the ability. So that is definitely something else to consider. Gigawatts, right? This is probably the lowest rate card, right? So 1 for 4, so it's vanilla with go again, but it only has 2 block, putting it slightly under. Now, it does have the flexibility of being able to buff our wrench, which I think makes it sizable enough, because then we can get that steam counter and we can get that value back through that sort of scenario. Now, both Hyper Scrapper and Steel Street Hoons are on rate because they're blues. They're essentially 3 cost 5s with go again, right? But Hyper Scrapper has the nice upside of if it does land, we get the 6 resources, which can be very solid, and Steel Street Hoons has the 4 block potential, right? So again, by taking more items, we activate these galvanized cards like Steel Street Hoons and Soup Up and give ourselves those 4 block cards for those breakpoints, which is definitely really nice to do. Now, in terms of our utility and pitch, right? So this is how we smooth out the curve of the deck. So we have to rationalize how much everything's going to cost us, how many 1s, how many 2s, right? How many resources we generally need for a turn. And generally speaking, as it currently is, it's around 2, right? On average, we need 2 resources to really kickstart a turn. We can get by with 1, and 3 is just going to make it nice and buttery, right? So generally speaking, we have yellows through and through, right? And then some valuable blues just because of their effects over some of the yellows that we can take. Now, in terms of the other utility effects, Pulse Wave Harpoon, right, despite being under rate or vanilla, so 1 for 4 with go again, it has a sizable effect of when this attacks hero. They reveal X cards from their hand, where X is the number of times you boosted this combat chain, and then choose an action card that has block value less than or equal to the number of times we've boosted. So it is hand disruption, which makes it nice and solid. So it's a really good utility card, but it also means that we do have to try and get to that 3 boost points, right? Hence why we want the lower curve of attacks rather than some of those big attacks to really make use of our hyperdrivers. Now, we also have Heist, right? Again, we have more items being able to be banished, so Heist is a bit more sizable. And then for the items, we have Overload Script, Penetration Script, Clamp Press, and of course our hyperdriver. So Overload Script, allowing us to give our attacks overpower, means that that breakpoint of anything over 3 becomes a lot nicer, right? Especially for those on-hit effects like Heist, as we can force our opponent to use some of their other block mechanics, right? Defense reactions, instants, or equipment, which is what we want to do. We want to just wear down our opponent and exhaust them before we fatigue out. Now, Penetration Script, similarly, allows us to get over that threshold, so it takes our 0-3s, makes them 0 for 4, which is definitely solid. And again, it's an item that, to me, should pressure our opponent into blocking Banksy, rather than just when we find a clamp press, right? Because again, the hyperdriver isn't quite doing enough to force our opponent's hand, so we want a bit more valuable items, right? Now, with that in mind, that is how I start deck construction. So we package all this together, and then where I like to head over to is the Draw 4 tab. So here, this is basically my first step in actually testing the deck, right? So basically what I like to do is just spam through the draw and think about the turns that we're playing, right? What exactly does this turn accomplish? What's its shortcomings? Have I bricked, right? What exactly do I have to do to tweak the deck? So for instance here, nice and simple, we could Boom Grenade, Bias Update, Sprocket Rocket, right? Which definitely forces our opponent to block a bunch. And then we could hitch into Banksy since we have cranked an item, right? So that's solid. Banksy then also threatens us up keeping the Boom Grenade. So we've done, what? A 3, a 6, that pressures the extra 4, and then an extra 3 to follow on. So to me, that's a solid starting turn, right? Obviously, if I was going first, my main objective would be to actually just max and set up the hyperdriver, rather than obviously overextending to just be blocked out by our opponent. So that turn probably would have been something that gets me the hyperdriver and allows me to set up the Boom Grenade without cranking it, right? Now, for this turn, it's a little bit worse because we've hit a lot of our high-cost cards. So if we don't have the hyperdriver set up, this can get really rough, right? So T-Bone is obviously our starting point. Klloo Foundry Cart to then play one of the two, or the one into Maxx, but generally speaking, this is a really, really rough turn to see. That shouldn't really happen as much as it does in the deck, but unfortunately, this is just what happens. So, generally speaking, this would be an indication that maybe Heist or Throttle needs to kind of go, right? So probably Heist, since Throttle is above rate, right? And doesn't rely on having a triggerable ability that our opponent can contest to put it above rate, right? But, right, I'll just go through, look at all the hands, figure out what needs to change, and that's the next step in my testing. To follow on from that, we then go over to Talishare, and we just play against the training dummy, right? So single player, private or public, doesn't really matter, practice dummy, and generally speaking, I like to run through the whole deck, right? So I play through the entire deck, and just basically, since we're aggro, I look at how much damage we've pressured each turn. Sorry for the zoom in, right? It's not the actual Talishare window that I normally use, but, right, that's how I go about testing the deck. Now, obviously, if you're taking something that's a bit more defensive or relying on hit triggers, it can definitely be a bit more awkward to test and theorize from just playing against the training dummy, but nice and easy in aggro, right? We're just looking for how much damage we're throwing out each turn, how much that could potentially force our opponent to block, or at least chip them down. And that's how I sort of rationalize the deck. Now, in that sense, Maxx is still a far calling from what Aurora can put out, which is definitely unfortunate, so you do need to rely on some of those other mechanics to try and force your opponent to block. And as it currently stands, right, unless you're Evo Mech, I don't think there's too many for you to actually rely on, right? We have Pulse Wave Harpoon. I'm not taking Mechanic Shockwave at the moment, but again, this is the starting point for my deck construction. So we've assembled the deck, we've thought about the cards, how everything sort of synergizes together. Again, we're focusing on Banksy and that core gameplay loop, so I want more items to crank, and therefore I want other cards to actually synergize with items, hence the Dumpster Dive, the Sprocket Rocket, and the action point generating boots, right? And then I go to the draw 4, give it a test, right? See how many times I brick, and then we go over to Talishare and run through it against the dummy to see how much damage we can actually output. So, how do we fare? Well, running through the whole deck, decent amount of turns, 15. So I'm pitching more than what I have been with my other aggro variants of the Maxx deck. Now, in terms of the total damage threaded, this is definitely higher, right? Usually hit around 130 to 150, so this being 186 thanks to the penetration script, the clamp press, and generally speaking, just being able to throw out a bit more above rate cards, right? Because I was taking a lot of 0 for 3s, is definitely solid. And then the actual turn structures, there's a few weak points where we've lost momentum because of hyperdrivers, and you can't see my mouse, so forgive me. There we go, right? But the turns where we sort of then gain our tempo back are quite sizable, right? So yeah, definitely a start, but we'll have to see how it fares when we actually take it to some proper games. Hope you enjoyed. See ya.